Good morning. Today we're going to be discussing the Cabinet of the United States of America. Now, this has much in common with the UK Cabinet, but what you need to know is what the similarities are, the differences are, and which is more important, the US version or the UK version. So let's start off with a similarity. The Cabinet is essentially all of the heads of departments of all the different executive departments that they are. So, for example, housing or energy or the Secretary of State or education, things like that. And each one of these members of the Cabinet has a special responsibility and their own kind of area that they are going to be looking after. Now, the Cabinet hasn't always existed. It started off with just simply three, basically Home Affairs, Foreign Affairs, and Money, I think was the other one. But it's grown over time as different presidents have decided, well, I need someone to take care of this or take care of that. And it's currently around about the 15 mark. You can see here that this particular picture here is bigger than the 15, but some of these are other members such as the Vice President or various legal officials or so on. The President can therefore create or abolish departments as he or she feels fit, and that of course can then show that particular president's priorities or not priorities. So, for example, when the Environmental Protection Agency was created, that showed an increase of that in terms of presidential importance, and when departments are then merged with others, they decline. The Cabinet is not a constitutional requirement. It says nowhere in the Constitution that there must be a president, the president must have a cabinet, this is their roles, this is their responsibilities. So it's very much kind of there by kind of convention, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and there are no specific powers given to them, which definitely weakens them in the face of everything else. If you think about it, the Supreme Court has a very defined role, Congress has a very defined role, specific role, whereas this, no constitutional requirement, therefore its powers are vague and perhaps weaker. It does, however, say in the Constitution, and I'll move to one side here, that the President may require advice of the principal officers of each of his departments. I might be sitting in front of the other one as well. So, may require advice of the principal officers is the phrase in the Constitution. So, first of all, may? That's not very constitutional. Everything in the Constitution is will and does, and this will happen, and it should be this, and it should be that. Well, no, sorry, not should. Is this, is that. So to have this phrase of the president may require advice of the principal officers is rather unusual, but it definitely weakens the cabinet further as well, that this is not a constitutional group that will give their views to the president, but that they may, and it could be useful, and so on. However, the very first president did start having regular cabinet meetings, so it wasn't like this was something that kind of grew up over time. The very first president was like, well, I have these members that I want to be in charge of my departments, and I want them to all meet together, and we're going to call this a cabinet meeting, all the heads of my various departments. So it's been there ever since the very first president, George Washington, and therefore cabinet meetings have become convention, which we know far more from UK politics. It happens because it's always happened, and we can't stop happening it because it's always been there, despite it not being a regular rule. But there's also two ways to understand this question. If I was to say to you, or the exam question comes up, to what extent is the American cabinet important? There are two ways to address and to think about that question. The first one is to ask, well, are the individual members of the cabinet important? The individuals. Is the Secretary of State in charge of Foreign Affairs important? Of course. Is the Secretary in charge of Education important? They're responsible for the education of America. These people, these individuals are important. But the second question is, well, is the group important? Does the meeting of all these heads of departments together actually have any relevance or importance? And it's important to kind of address these topics separately. Because if we say that the group isn't important, which I think would be my conclusion, that does not mean that the individual departments are not important as well. And in many cases, it's the opposite. Where do you get the cabinet from? Where do these individuals, these people that take on the role of Secretary of State and Energy come from? Well, like all good cabinets, you could get them from IKEA. Okay, don't write that in the exam. Okay, but you could talk about Congress. Some of them come from Congress, but there's a problem. If the president says to you, hey, congressman, I want you to be in my cabinet, America has a clear separation of branches. You cannot be in Congress and be a member of the executive branch. You have to quit one to join the other. Barack Obama did it when he went from being a congressman to being president. But there is a difference between going to become president and going to become member of the cabinet. Now, because if you give up your Congress job, you're giving up what is effectively a relatively secure job where you have quite a lot of independence, where you are accountable to the voters, to a job where you are far more accountable to the president and almost at the whim of the president. If you get fired, you can't go back to being a congressman easily because it just doesn't work like that. Now, so many active congressmen, both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, are loath to give up their positions. There are a few. There's a name that's going around in my head that I can't quite remember. I need to look it up. Let me do so quickly because there's a story I wish to tell. Jeff Sessions. Okay, Jeff Sessions was he was a senator, I believe. And he was one of the first senators to come out and actually publicly endorse Donald Trump. So Donald Trump loved him. He was like, "Thank you so much. You've come to endorse me. Have a role in my cabinet." And he made him Attorney General, I believe. And Jeff Sessions, look up a picture, you might recognize his face, came to join the cabinet as the Attorney General, but then immediately recused himself from the Russia investigation. Like, did Russia get involved in the presidential elections, and which Trump hated. And they went back and forth for about a year, maybe even more than a year, and eventually Jeff Sessions was fired by President Trump. But of course, Jeff Sessions then has lost both his cabinet job and his congressional job. And the last thing I heard about him, he was trying to stand again to Congress, to get back into Congress, to take back the job he lost. So it is a big risk if you leave Congress to become a member of the executive in this way. A far better place to find, or more regular place to find members to be in your executive is a governor. So a governor is almost like a little president of a particular state, a governor of Texas, a governor of New York. And they have term limits the same way that presidents have term limits. So they won't be there forever, and they might be looking for positions that they can take on. This is Rick Perry. He's Trump's current energy secretary. Also mayors. Mayors get voted in, mayors get voted out. Their job security is not quite as strong. This is Julian Castro, who's one of the people that's thinking of standing for presidency as a Democrat. He was also, though, served in Obama's cabinet. All the ones I've talked about so far, if I get rid of that image for a second, these are all elected still in some way, other than the IKEA. Congress, they are elected representatives. Governors, they're elected. Mayors, they're elected. But here's another key difference between the UK and the US one. In the UK, you have to be a member of the House of Commons. You have to be a current elected individual to be in this cabinet, to head up one of these departments. But that's not the case in America. The president can appoint anyone as long as he can get them through the nomination process. So you actually can go and to get people from other industries, business, academics, etc., etc. Now, this is Stephen Wu, who was a president of physics and became the head of the US Department of Energy. So he is a clear example where the president goes, well, I want a real expert here. I'm not necessarily looking for a political appointee. I'm looking for someone that really knows their stuff. And so he goes and finds Stephen Wu. This is Rex Tillerson. He was a very successful businessman, oil, I believe, and Trump appointed him as his Secretary of State. So from business to foreign affairs. Now, Rex Tillerson didn't do the job very long and was fired, but most people get fired under Trump, so perhaps that's not an indicator of success or failure. But it meant that Trump was looking elsewhere for his cabinet members. He might find them from the army. This is Mad Dog, I can't remember his surname now, Mathis. And Trump appointed him directly from the army to head up defense, and then later his chief of staff, and from other places as well. This is Ben Carson. This is the retired neurosurgeon Ben Carson, who is now, believe it or not, in charge of housing. From medicine to housing. Now, of course, they may be brilliant at their jobs. They may have lots of expertise. I'm not in any way knocking him or anything like that, but I'm pointing out that the cabinet can sometimes have elected representatives in there, or ex-elected representatives. It can sometimes have relevant people with relevant experience, or sometimes just have people that perhaps have been supportive of the president in some way, ending up with roles in that executive office. Can the president pick anyone, though? Like, could you just grab someone off the street and say, right, I want you to be in charge of the environment or whatever it might be? Well, the answer is yes, as long as he can get them through the nomination process. Now, one of the powers that the Senate has, that the House of Representatives doesn't, is that they approve or disapprove the nominations that the president makes to both the Supreme Court, but also to executive office. Now, this is Betsy DeVos, and she is the Secretary of State for Education. And she very nearly didn't make it. She did such a bad job in the interview process, and her experience was seen to be irrelevant, that the Democrats were very hostile to her, and indeed many of the Republicans were pretty hostile to her as well. And whereas the vast majority of nominations by the president do eventually get through, hers came down to 50-50. And if it comes to 50-50, then the vice president is required to make the deciding vote. And there's a link here. If you get the PowerPoint link, you can go and see a video clip of Mike Pence making that deciding vote to kind of get her through. So the president can appoint anyone as long as he thinks he can get through the Senate. Now, you could make an argument here saying the nomination process is terrible because Betsy got through, or the nomination process is terrible because it rarely fails. But you could also go the other way. You could also say the fact that this system exists stops the president from picking anyone who is completely inappropriate. Like, maybe the president never puts forward someone that is completely inappropriate because they wouldn't get through. But then again, maybe here you've got to look at Betsy and say, well, maybe that's not the case. But I'm saying you can play with this as an example or as an idea, depending on the way you wish to argue in your essay. Diversity of the cabinet. We've talked about in the past how diverse Congress is, how diverse the UK Parliament is, and the US cabinet was becoming more and more diverse until you get to Trump. The graph here behind you is showing you the number of white men in the first cabinet of each president. And you can see that the number of white men slowly declines. If you go from Reagan up to Bush, you go 17, 12, 10, 11, 8, and then Trump, we're way back up to 18. So his cabinet is less diverse than Ronald Reagan's, who was president in 1980. Now, there's a separate debate to be had about whether representation matters and whether you have to have diversity in your cabinet. That's a different debate. But if you think diversity matters, then Trump is a step backwards. To put that more into, give more examples here, you can see here the amount of women and the amount of racial minorities that each president has. The pattern is exactly the same, that they get more and more and more diverse, more women, more racial minorities, until you get to Barack Obama, where we're at its peak, and then we pull right back with Donald Trump. Donald Trump has more women than he has racial minorities in his cabinet. What are the other things that might want to be balanced? Well, it's the same as you'd expect in Congress and Parliament. Issues such as race, ideology, age, gender, region. There are articles, and I can link you some if you're interested, that talk about who had the most diverse cabinet and who didn't, and what kind of things you might want to put in. Now, if you are a president, you might be sitting there putting your cabinet together thinking, well, I want to show that my cabinet is representative of the whole of America, because it sends out a message, doesn't it, to the people and to the other people in politics that if you have a cabinet which is diverse, then you are showing yourself to be a president who is trying to represent everyone, whatever your race, whether you're from the north of America or the south of America, no matter what your age. It sends out messages about who you are, what you stand for, and what you represent. Donald Trump, it would appear, is less interested in these. And I think Trump is just more interested in who he feels he can do business with and who kind of does a good job. So you could defend Trump here and say, he's not getting sidetracked with what people look like and he's going for what they can do. Or you can argue it the other way and say that Trump has taken a step back on diversity and just brought it back to being an old white men's club. Your choice, but the point is there to be made. Does the president actually meet with his cabinet? Now, again, let's go back to that question I mentioned earlier. Individuals versus the collective. The president, of course, meets with some of the individuals in his cabinet regularly. The Secretary of State, being in charge of foreign affairs, would be a significant one here. But how often does the president actually meet with their whole cabinet group? Because the UK Prime Minister does it most weeks when Parliament is sitting. It's a key part of UK politics is Prime Minister's questions on a Wednesday, cabinet meetings on a Thursday, and additional cabinet meetings when there's a big issue coming up. Compare this to American. Ronald Reagan, on average, met with his cabinet about 12 times a year. George Bush, the senior one, that's Bush 41, met with them only 6 times a year. Clinton, about 6. Bush Jr., about 6. Barack Obama, about 3. Now, they essentially, what we can see, like 3 meetings a year is like once every school term. It's tiny. It shows the lack of importance of this meeting, and you can use these numbers to prove that point. This might be your killer argument. You know, if this meeting was where the key decisions were being made, if this meeting was where the heads of department were really having an influence, then they would need to be met with regularly, but they're not. I've written decreasing under 12 and 6 here. In both the cases under Reagan and George Bush, they met with their cabinets more at the beginning. I think the first one was like 20 times a year for Reagan, but it decreases as they go on. So there's an element to which they're kind of setting the agenda at the beginning, they're kind of getting to know their staff, but once they kind of know what everyone's doing, the meeting is no longer kind of relevant and they go down and down. Donald Trump, I'm going to be honest, I couldn't find the numbers of how often he does his cabinet meetings. So I would avoid, unless you can find out or I find out, I would avoid making those points. But Trump's have unfortunately picked up an interesting side effect, that he often uses his cabinet meetings to bring in the press and to show off how unified they are, or also to show off how great they think he is. One of his first ever cabinet meetings, he went around the table and he kind of got all of them to talk about how wonderful it was that they were there and all the great things they were going to do and how grateful they were to the president, to the point that other political leaders just started mocking it and did their own parody versions going around the table where people were like fawning all over them and things like that. So Trump in a way uses them as a media opportunity, which in a way you could actually argue the cabinet meeting is important because it gives the president a chance to show to the media what is kind of going on or how well they think they're doing. But perhaps it still doesn't make the point that the key decisions are being made. And there's an article to Trump and the cabinet. So why do it? Why have these meetings at all then if they are not happening regularly? Well, these are the benefits for the president themselves. The president gets to show their agenda, gets to sit down with all his heads of departments and say, this is my focus. So for example, Obama had a big focus on health at the beginning of his first term. Other presidents might have focus on austerity or small government, which is what Ronald Reagan had at the beginning of his. But it lets them set the agenda across all of their departments. Just like Donald Trump, it gives an opportunity to invite the media in and say, look, this is my executive, this is what we are doing, this is where we're at, to kind of show them off as a unit. It gives a chance for genuine debate, to kind of get various issues sorted out. The reason why I've got Bush here, if I can remind myself, was because there was a famous incident where George Bush, they had to sort out whether they were going to have an oil pipeline. A Russian oil pipeline, and so various members, it got quite heated and they had a big shouting match in the cabinet meeting. So I guess you could argue that's a good thing because they were able to kind of sort out that issue once and for all about whether they were going to build a Russian pipe or allow a Russian pipeline or not, and they kind of sorted it out. It also gives a chance to talk about the big issues of the day. This is the Ebola virus. So the president will call additional cabinet meetings when something major happens that he wants to address or be seen to be addressing. So maybe it will be when there's a war, maybe when there's a shutdown, when there is an issue to deal with such as Ebola or something like that. So the benefits there can be that they can get, right, I want everyone working on this issue right now. It also gives an opportunity to prompt action. So say you've got a member of your executive that you're waiting for them to do something and they're just not doing it. It also gives you an opportunity to kind of semi-publicly be like, well, what's going on? And Obama famously did this with his Secretary of Defense, a man called Chuck Hagel. In the cabinet meeting, Obama kind of gave him a bit of dressing down, kind of saying, well, I don't think you're moving fast enough on this, Chuck. So the president is able to kind of go around the table and say, get on with this, move on with this, make it happen. And it's also an opportunity for personal contact, an opportunity for the president to, without necessarily having to book lots and lots of individual meetings, to see them as a whole and to get a bit of FaceTime and to talk to them and so on. This is important because sometimes the president might not necessarily know who you are, despite the fact that you're in his cabinet. This is Ronald Reagan and Sam Pierce. And Ronald Reagan met him and thought he was a mayor. And he was like, oh, how are things going in your town? And Sam Pierce was like, I'm actually your Secretary of State for Housing. So it is important that the president has these cabinet meetings so he kind of knows who's in the cabinet and what they're doing and can actually, kind of understand what's going on in those departments. What about the other way around, though? We've talked about the president, what the benefits are for him or her versus the cabinet, but the benefits for the cabinet members. not a huge amount, as you'll see. Well, they might get to make some friends in the cabinet, to make contacts. Now, that's not necessarily a tiny thing, because you do want your departments to be working together, but it's an intangible thing. It also gives a chance for them to argue, and kind of, you'll often find finance and everyone else are kind of going against each other, because the finance department won't want to be paying for something and the other departments will want their money. So it gives them a chance for them to have those particular debates. It gets a chance to have a bit of a chit chat, finding out what the other departments are doing, because if you know what the other departments are doing, you can be like, oh, hang on a minute, well, I can actually kind of fit in with that and we can kind of make this one work. And the other reason for that is actually America's a huge place. And Washington is a huge place. And whereas most of the executive in England is based in Whitehall, i.e. most of the cabinet members are physically located very close to each other, and they meet up in the House of Commons a few times a week. So the UK cabinet, everyone's going to know each other pretty well, because they're just forced together over and over again. Whereas the American one, they're not. They're not all going to be MPs, or not all going to be congressmen. They're not all going to come from the same state. They're not going to work necessarily in the same state or the same building. So having an opportunity here to kind of communicate and synergize is probably important, and probably worth you giving half a paragraph to in an essay. Even if it's not a particularly strong argument, it is something that you can back up the way that I have just done there. It also gives you a chance for a bit of FaceTime with the president. There's a picture of Piers Morgan. It gives you a chance to actually meet the president, because if you are the Secretary of State, I've made this point a few times, you are going to be meeting the president quite a lot. If you are the Secretary of State for, I don't know, let's pick something else, Veterans Affairs, Transport, Labour, you might not meet the president all that much, especially if the president isn't all that interested in that particular issue. Obviously, some presidents will be very interested in a certain issue, other presidents won't be. So it does give all of them a chance to actually get a bit of time with the president. It also gives you a chance to get a bit of status for yourself. If the media is there, you will appear on TV. It gives you a chance to feel, yeah, I'm actually doing something really important here. And it also means when you go back to your departments, you can be like, well, I was just speaking to the president and this is what we've agreed. So it enhances your status both within the country and within your own departments. And so those are the benefits for the cabinet members. So is the cabinet actually important as a group? Spoiler, no. I think it would be very hard to write an essay that says that the US cabinet is important. It's far easier to argue one about the UK cabinet, because you can talk about all the things that happened with Brexit and people resigning and collective cabinet responsibility, and there's various things you can kind of bring in here to show that the UK cabinet is more important. Not necessarily important, but more important. But here's 4 reasons why the US cabinet is not important. Number 1, it's not important because there's no constitutional requirement for them other than that they may give some advice, which defuses it to begin with. Secondly, the Prime Minister, the word Prime Minister means first minister, first among equals, pares, something or other. It's something in Latin. They are all ministers, but the Prime Minister is the First Minister. There's a kind of an idea here that they are all on the same level, but the Prime Minister is just kind of slightly above. But this is the President versus Secretaries of State. The President is directly elected, has their own personal mandate. The President is, if the difference between the Cabinet and the Prime Minister is this, the difference between the Cabinet and the President is this. There's just a huge disparity between the relevant importance of the members. Also, the American cabinet is never a stepping stone to the presidency. Most of them aren't elected at that time, none of them will be elected at that time, and it's very hard to move from one to the other. The most recent example I can think of is Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State under Obama. She was well known. She used it to increase her standing. She went off. She came back. She ran for president. She didn't get it. The same with President Trump. I mean, how many of them really can you name, and do any of them feel like they're going to go for a presidential run? There's one called Nikki something that stood down last year that might be a candidate in the future. But again, here we're talking about exceptions. Whereas in the UK, again, think about how many of them went for the leadership after Theresa May resigned. You started off with like 12 or something like that, and I think all of them had some sort of cabinet experience. Maybe not a top job, but they were there. And also, lastly, they're not important because some of them simply just don't work closely with the president. They work in their own departments, in their own way, doing their own thing, which is fine, but they're not necessarily important in terms of this kind of cabinet meeting. And the EXOP is far closer. Final thought. What on earth is the EXOP? Well, as well as the cabinet, you have this other branch of government, which is called the Executive Office of the President, which is basically the president's own personal departments, own personal advisors, and in many ways, the EXOP, which I'll be discussing in our next video, is far more important than the cabinet. Thank you for watching. Hope you find it useful. Give the video a like if you liked it, and I'll see you on the next one.